I helped my friend escape her abusive relationship, but the truth behind her escape left me paralyzed. I never expected the truth to hit me like this. I thought I was just helping a friend get out of a bad situation, one where she was being controlled, manipulated, and abused. But when I helped her escape her abusive relationship, I had no idea what I was really getting myself into. It wasn't just her life that was in danger, it was mine too. I met Sarah in college. We were in the same class, and though we were different in many ways, we hit it off almost immediately. She was outgoing, fun, and could always make me laugh even on my worst days. I was a little more reserved, but somehow we balanced each other out. Over the years, our friendship deepened, and I became one of the few people she confided in. When Sarah started dating Tom, I had my reservations. Something about him just didn't sit right with me. He was charming, sure, but I could tell he had this air of control over her. At first, it was small things, like how he always seemed to make decisions for her, or how he didn't like her hanging out with other friends. I tried to ignore it, telling myself I was overthinking things. But when she started missing meetings, showing up late to hangouts, and her bubbly personality began to fade, I knew something was off. I didn't want to accuse Tom of anything, but it became clear that Sarah wasn't the same person she had been when I first met her. She started pulling away from me and other friends, and every time I asked her if everything was okay, she would just brush it off with a weak smile and change the subject. It wasn't until one night, about 6 months into their relationship, that I realized the truth. It was a Saturday night when everything changed. I had invited Sarah over to my place for a movie night, something we used to do all the time. I hadn't seen her in over a week, and I was starting to feel like she was slipping further away. I hoped that by spending time together, I could get her to open up about what was really going on. When she arrived, she looked different, tired, pale, and her eyes had this distant, almost vacant look to them. I tried to make small talk, but it was clear something was weighing heavily on her. After a few hours, she finally let her guard down. "I don't know what to do anymore," she said, her voice trembling. "I'm scared of him. I don't even know who I am anymore." My heart sank. I had been worried for so long, but hearing her say those words hit me like a punch to the gut. She went on to explain how Tom had been emotionally abusive for months. He'd started isolating her from her family and friends, constantly criticizing her appearance, and threatening to hurt himself if she ever tried to leave him. It was a sobering revelation. I never imagined it would get that bad. The worst part? Sarah had been too afraid to ask for help. She told me that she felt trapped, like no matter what she did, she was always walking on eggshells around Tom. She was convinced that if she left him, he would make good on his threats. I knew I couldn't just stand by and do nothing. I had to help her escape, but even then I didn't fully understand what I was about to get myself into. The next few days were a blur. Sarah and I stayed in constant contact, making plans for how she could leave Tom without him noticing. It had to be subtle. If Tom found out, there was no telling what he might do. Sarah was terrified, and the last thing I wanted was to make things worse. We started small. She began packing a few essentials, clothes, toiletries, her ID, and some cash. Nothing too obvious, just a few things she could grab if she needed to leave quickly. She told me she'd arrange a casual dinner with Tom, which would give her the opportunity to slip away unnoticed. I'd be waiting for her in the car, ready to take her wherever she needed to go. But even as we made our plans, doubt crept in. What if she wasn't ready to leave? What if she still loved him despite everything he'd done? And if Tom found out, would he come after me too? I kept telling myself that helping her was the right thing, but the risks were mounting. I tried to reassure Sarah, but deep down, I was scared. I didn't know what kind of person Tom really was. Would he let her go, or would he lash out? We agreed that we would wait for the perfect moment, a time when he'd be distracted, maybe out of the house, so she could slip away unnoticed. I checked my phone constantly, waiting for her to text me that it was time. And then, the message came. It was time. The night Sarah texted me, I felt a rush of adrenaline and fear all at once. My heart was pounding in my chest as I got into my car, ready to meet her. I couldn't believe it was finally happening. The moment I'd been preparing for was here. But with every step closer to her escape, I realized how dangerous this truly was. I pulled up to Sarah's place, parked a few streets away to avoid being spotted, and waited. The seconds ticked by so slowly, I could almost hear my heartbeat in the silence of the car. Every time my phone buzzed, I jumped, hoping it was her. I needed to know she was okay. Finally, I saw her, looking around nervously as she quickly walked toward my car. She had a bag in hand, and the look on her face was a mixture of fear and relief. As soon as she opened the door and slid into the passenger seat, I didn't waste a second. "Let's go," I said, my voice tense. We didn't speak much as I drove away, heading toward the city. Sarah was exhausted, emotionally drained, and I could tell the weight of everything she'd just done was beginning to settle in. She looked out the window, lost in thought. I kept glancing at her, wondering if she was second-guessing herself. She had spent so long trying to make things work with Tom, even after everything he'd put her through. I couldn't imagine what it felt like to walk away from someone you'd once loved. But I knew she was doing the right thing. The further we drove, the more I started to feel like we were truly escaping, like she was finally free. But there was a lingering question in my mind. Would Tom come after us? He was volatile, and I couldn't shake the feeling that he would try to stop her, no matter what it took. Make sure to like the video and subscribe so you never miss more shocking and real stories like this one. We made it to a small, quiet motel on the outskirts of the city. It was nothing fancy, but it was the best place we could think of to lay low for a while. I checked us in under a false name, making sure no one would trace us back to that night. Sarah was shaking now, her hands trembling as she unpacked the few things she had grabbed in her rush. The silence between us felt heavy. I couldn't imagine what was going through her mind, leaving everything behind, even the life she thought she had built. She sat down on the edge of the bed, staring at the floor. I could tell she was overwhelmed, exhausted from the emotional roller coaster. "Do you think he'll come after me?" she finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't have a clear answer for her. The truth was, I didn't know what Tom was capable of. He'd already shown signs of being possessive, manipulative, and controlling. Who knew what lengths he would go to, especially when he found out she had left him? "I don't know," I said honestly. "But we'll deal with it if it happens. Right now, you need to rest. You've made the hardest decision of your life, and we'll figure out the rest as it comes." She nodded, but I could see the fear still in her eyes. She tried to calm down, but I could tell the weight of the situation was starting to crush her. The silence lingered between us, both of us uncertain of what would happen next. The next morning, I woke up to a message on my phone. It was from Sarah's sister Emily, asking if Sarah was okay. Emily had been one of the few people who knew about Sarah's struggles with Tom, but even she hadn't known the full extent. I told her Sarah was safe, but I didn't go into detail. At that point, all we could do was keep moving forward day by day. Sarah had fallen asleep quickly the night before, but I knew she wouldn't be able to keep this up for long. The weight of the escape was starting to sink in. She wasn't just leaving an abusive relationship, she was leaving behind a life that, in some way, still mattered to her. Tom might have been controlling and manipulative, but he had been her world for a while. Later that afternoon, Sarah and I were sitting in the small diner across the street when we saw a familiar face walk through the door. It was Emily. She had driven all the way from their hometown to check on her sister. The moment she saw Sarah, she rushed over and wrapped her arms around her, whispering, "Are you okay?" I stood back, watching them embrace, but then my phone buzzed again. This time, it was a text from an unknown number. When I opened it, my stomach dropped. It was a photo of Sarah and me from last night, taken through the motel window. Someone had been watching us. I stared at the photo on my phone, feeling a wave of panic rise in my chest. Someone had been watching us. It wasn't a coincidence. This was deliberate. I quickly opened the message again, hoping there would be some explanation, but it was just a single, chilling line of text. "You can't run from this." My heart raced. I tried to shake off the fear, but it was hard. This wasn't just about Sarah anymore. It was about me, too. Whoever had sent this message knew exactly where we were, and it made me feel vulnerable, exposed. I immediately showed Sarah the photo, and she froze. "Who the hell would do this?" she asked, her voice shaking. Her earlier relief from escaping was quickly being replaced by anxiety and dread. "Maybe it's Tom," I said, though I wasn't sure. Tom was possessive, but this was something else. I was terrified that he was somehow tracking us, and I had no idea how to stop it. We hadn't even been here 24 hours. Emily, who had been sitting quietly up until that point, finally spoke. "We need to tell the police," she said. "This is serious. If someone is threatening you like this, you can't just ignore it." But I wasn't so sure. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that calling the police might escalate things, and we weren't even sure who was behind this. It could be anyone from Tom's side of the world, or worse, someone else we didn't even know. "I'll keep the phone on me," I said to Sarah, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "We'll figure it out, but we can't panic." Sarah looked at me, eyes wide with fear. "What if they come for us?" I couldn't answer that. Not yet. But I knew we needed a plan, one that would keep us safe. Over the next few days, the tension in the air grew thicker. Sarah and I stayed on high alert, constantly checking our phones, always expecting the worst. But no more messages came, at least not from the same number. Instead, the paranoia set in. I felt like I was being watched at every turn, and Sarah was no better. Even the smallest noise seemed to set her off. She'd jump at the sound of a car engine outside, or flinch at the slightest knock on the door. We tried to go about our days, but the constant stress was eating away at us. Every time I looked at Sarah, I could see the weight of everything she'd left behind. The life with Tom, the abuse, and now, the fear of what might happen next. I hated seeing her like this, but there wasn't much I could do to ease her mind. Then, one afternoon, there was a knock on the door. My stomach dropped. I opened the door cautiously, not knowing what to expect. Standing in front of me was a man I didn't recognize, a tall, broad-shouldered guy with dark sunglasses and a stern expression. He didn't introduce himself, but I could feel the tension radiating off him. "Is Sarah here?" he asked, his voice low and gravelly. I hesitated, trying to gauge whether this was someone we could trust or another threat. "She's inside," I replied, trying to sound confident despite the unease bubbling in my chest. "Who are you?" "I'm a friend of Tom's," he said, taking off his sunglasses and revealing cold, piercing eyes. "I'm here to make sure she's okay." My heart skipped a beat. This wasn't just some casual check-in. The way he said it, the threat behind his words, it made my blood run cold. Without waiting for a response, he pushed past me and entered the motel room. Sarah was sitting on the bed, her eyes wide as she saw the stranger. "What's going on?" she asked, standing up, clearly shaken. "I'm just here to make sure you're all right," the man said, his eyes scanning the room like he was looking for something. He was sizing up the situation, and I knew I had to act fast before things got out of hand. I stood tall, trying to keep my composure. "I think it's time for you to leave," I said firmly. "You don't have permission to be here." His gaze flickered between Sarah and me, a moment of hesitation. But then, without warning, he pulled out his phone and started typing something. "Let's just get this over with," he muttered, like he was trying to make a point. I stepped forward, ready to push him out, but he held his ground, his presence intimidating. That's when I realized he wasn't just here to check on Sarah. He was here to send a message, and I wasn't sure what that message was, but I knew it wouldn't be good. "Get out," I said again, my voice more forceful this time. He looked at me for a moment longer, then finally turned and walked out, leaving us in silence. My heart was racing. What had just happened? What did this man know? And why had he come? After the man left, I stood in the doorway for a long while, staring into the empty space where he had been standing. My mind was reeling, and I could feel the tension building inside me. I didn't know what this meant for us, or how we were supposed to move forward from here. But one thing was certain. Things were escalating fast. Sarah stood behind me, quiet, looking just as lost as I felt. We hadn't spoken a word since the man left. I wasn't sure what to say. How could I reassure her when I didn't even have all the answers myself? Finally, Sarah broke the silence. Who was he really? And why did he come here? I turned to face her, the question hanging heavy in the air. "I don't know," I admitted, "but I think it's time we face the truth. Tom's not just going to let this go. He's involved people, maybe even hired someone to keep an eye on us." Her eyes widened. "What do we do now?" I ran a hand through my hair, pacing the room. "We lay low. I'll try to figure out who he was and what he wants. But we can't keep running forever, Sarah. We need to make sure we're safe." She nodded, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and resolve. I could tell she was beginning to understand the magnitude of what we were up against. This wasn't just about leaving an abusive relationship anymore. This was about survival. The rest of the day was a blur. We spent the afternoon trying to figure out our next move. We couldn't go back to her old place, not with Tom and his people looking for her. I called a couple of distant relatives to see if we could stay with them, but none of them were in a position to help. It was frustrating, but I wasn't about to let that stop us. As night fell, the tension in the room seemed to increase. Every sound outside made us jump, and we both found ourselves glancing out the window constantly, checking for any sign of movement. It was in those moments when the world felt silent and still that the weight of what we had done, what Sarah had done, hit me. She had chosen me, but had I truly understood the cost of that decision? What if it was already too late to fix everything? The night passed slowly. We managed to get some sleep, though it was far from restful. Every time a car drove by, I was awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if Tom had found us. It felt like we were living in constant fear of the unknown. Then, early the next morning, my phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, but I answered it anyway. The voice on the other end made my heart drop. It was Tom. "Listen carefully," he said, his voice cold and calculated. "You think you can just take her from me and walk away unscathed? You're not the only one who's capable of playing dirty." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. I hadn't expected this, hadn't expected him to come for us so soon, but I had to remain calm. "What do you want, Tom?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "You'll see soon enough," he replied cryptically. "But trust me, you've made a mistake you won't be able to undo, and when I'm done, you'll wish you never crossed me." Before I could respond, the line went dead. I sat there, staring at the phone in my hand, my heart racing. I knew this was far from over, but hearing his voice, so calm, so menacing, told me that we were in deeper trouble than I had realized. I turned to Sarah, who had been listening in from across the room. Her face was pale, and I could see the fear written all over her. "Tom's not going to let this go," I said quietly. "He just warned me, and I'm afraid it's only going to get worse from here." Sarah didn't say anything at first. She just sat there, eyes wide, processing what I had said. I could tell she was terrified, but what else could we do but keep moving forward? We couldn't turn back now. "We'll figure it out," I said, trying to reassure both her and myself. "But we need to stay one step ahead of him. He won't stop until he's gotten what he wants, and right now, that's you." As the days passed, we stayed in hiding. I made sure to keep my phone close at all times, ignoring the persistent thoughts that kept creeping into my head. What was Tom really capable of? Was he truly as dangerous as he seemed? Or was I just spiraling into paranoia? It felt like we were being hunted, every day spent looking over our shoulders, not knowing when he would show up next. Every knock on the door made my heart race. Every unfamiliar face in the street felt like a threat. We couldn't keep living like this. Then, out of nowhere, a breakthrough came, though it wasn't one I had ever expected. One evening, as I was going through some emails on my laptop, I noticed a new message from a strange account. The subject line was simple: "I know what's going on." My heart skipped. I opened it immediately. The message was short but chilling. "You're being played. What you think you know about Tom isn't the full story. There's more to this than you think. Don't trust anyone in your circle." A friend. I stared at the screen, my mind racing. Who could this be? Was it someone Tom had planted in our lives to throw me off? Or was it someone genuinely trying to help us? The email didn't provide any other details, no explanation or clarification, just that one cryptic message. I was left in a state of confusion, unsure of what to do with this new information, but I knew I couldn't ignore it. I turned to Sarah, who had been sitting on the couch, her face pale and anxious. She saw the look on my face immediately. "What's wrong?" she asked. "Someone just sent me a message," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "They claim there's more to this than we know, that we're being played, and they warned me not to trust anyone." Sarah's eyes widened. "What do we do?" "I'm not sure," I said, "but I'm going to find out who this is. We need to know who's trying to help us, and who's really working against us." With that, I set to work, trying to trace the message. But deep down, I knew things were about to get a lot more complicated. The days following the mysterious email were a whirlwind of confusion and uncertainty. I couldn't shake the feeling that something deeper was going on, something that I hadn't been able to see before. I spent hours trying to trace the email, but it led nowhere. It was an anonymous address with no traceable details. The more I tried, the more I felt like I was chasing my own tail. It was frustrating, but I knew I couldn't stop. Meanwhile, Sarah was growing more restless. I could see the fear in her eyes every time she looked at me, as if the walls were closing in. She was scared of Tom, scared of the unknown. But what terrified me the most was that I could see how much the fear was starting to take a toll on her. One night, after a long day of trying to figure out the next move, I found myself sitting in the quiet of our motel room, staring at my phone. The thought of calling the police crossed my mind several times, but I kept holding back. What if it wasn't Tom who was playing the game? What if someone else was behind it all? And then, as if on cue, the phone rang again. I didn't recognize the number, but this time, I felt a strange calm wash over me. I answered it, expecting the worst, but what I heard left me frozen in place. "Alec," a familiar voice said, one I hadn't heard in years. "It's me, Ethan." I could barely believe it. Ethan, my best friend, the one I had trusted for years. I felt the bile rise in my throat as his name left my lips. "What the hell do you want?" His voice, usually so confident and reassuring, now sounded shaky, as if he was somewhere on the edge of desperation. "I know you're angry, but hear me out. I've been trying to fix this, trying to make it right." I didn't respond immediately. Part of me wanted to hang up, to cut him off once and for all. But another part of me needed to know the truth. I needed answers. "Fix what?" I asked, my voice low and dangerous. "You've already ruined everything, Ethan. You betrayed me, you betrayed Sarah, and now you're calling me, asking for what? Forgiveness?" "Not forgiveness," he said, his voice cracking. "I just need you to understand. It's not what you think. The whole thing, Tom, Sarah, it's all been orchestrated." I froze, every muscle in my body tensing. "What do you mean? What are you talking about?" There was a long pause before he spoke again. "I can't explain it all over the phone, but I'm coming to you, in person. We need to talk. Trust me, Alec. There's a bigger picture here, and you're only seeing a small part of it." I sat there, stunned, my heart racing. Was this some kind of sick joke, or was he really trying to tell me something? Either way, I couldn't just sit around anymore. I had to know the truth. "I'll be waiting," I said, my voice shaking with a mix of anger and disbelief. "But don't think for a second that this will fix anything. You've already gone too far." And then I hung up. I turned to Sarah, who had been sitting silently beside me the whole time. She looked up at me with concern, but I could see the unease in her eyes. "What's going on?" she asked quietly. "It's Ethan," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "He wants to talk. He says there's more to this than we know." She didn't say anything for a moment, but I could see her processing the information. Then, without a word, she stood up and grabbed her bag. "Let's go. We need to get to the bottom of this." And so, we prepared ourselves for what could be the final confrontation, the last chance for truth, or perhaps the ultimate betrayal. We arrived at the meeting spot, a small park on the edge of town, the kind of place that felt too quiet for the storm I could feel brewing inside me. I didn't know what to expect from Ethan, but after everything, I was certain of one thing. Whatever happened next, it was going to change everything. Sarah and I waited for what felt like an eternity, the sun slowly sinking behind the horizon. I kept replaying the conversation in my head, trying to make sense of what Ethan had said. What could possibly be the bigger picture he was talking about? I wasn't sure if I was ready for whatever truth he was about to drop, but I knew I had to face it. Then, out of nowhere, I saw him walking toward us. Ethan. He looked different, disheveled, like he hadn't slept in days. His usual confident swagger was gone, replaced with something darker. I stood up as he approached, my heart pounding in my chest. "Alec," he said, his voice hoarse, barely above a whisper. "What the hell, Ethan?" I snapped, unable to keep the anger out of my voice. "You destroyed everything. My relationship with Sarah, my trust in you. How could you do this?" He lowered his head, avoiding my gaze. I know, man, but you don't understand. There's more to this than just me and Sarah. There's something bigger going on. Something that—" "Save it," I interrupted, my voice shaking with rage. "You don't get to do that. You don't get to pull the bigger picture card now. You've already betrayed me in the worst possible way." Ethan looked up at me then, his eyes filled with desperation. "I didn't want any of this to happen. You have to believe me, Alec. It wasn't just me and Sarah. There's someone else. Someone who's been pulling the strings all along, and they've been using both of us to get what they want." I froze. What was he talking about? My mind was spinning. "Who? Who's been manipulating us?" It's Tom," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Tom, the same Tom who had been trying to get us out of hiding, the same Tom who had been threatening us. Tom, I repeated, feeling the weight of his words. What do you mean? Ethan took a deep breath, his eyes darting around nervously as if he was afraid someone might be listening in. He's been behind it all. He's the one who set everything in motion. He's the one who convinced me to get close to Sarah, to make you believe she was the one. He's the one who's been feeding us lies, manipulating us for his own gain. My world spun. This was too much. I had trusted Tom. I had thought he was just a victim in all of this, someone who had been dealing with a crazy ex and had nowhere else to turn. But now everything was falling apart. I turned to Sarah, who had been standing silently by my side. She looked just as shocked as I felt. Is this true? I asked, my voice cracking with disbelief. She nodded slowly, her face pale. I don't know. But if Ethan's right, then we've all been played. Ethan, his face full of regret, stepped forward. I'm sorry, Alec. I never wanted to hurt you. But Tom, he's been using me, using us, to get back at you, and I don't know how much of this was real anymore. I didn't know how to respond. This was the moment that I had been dreading, the truth, wrapped up in betrayal, shame, and manipulation. But the pieces were starting to fall into place. Everything that had happened, the lies, the cheating, the secrets, it was all part of Tom's plan. I looked at Ethan, my former best friend, the man who had been like a brother to me. I don't know if I can ever forgive you, I said, my voice barely audible. But I'll figure this out. I have to. It's been a few weeks since that conversation, and I'm still trying to process everything, the betrayal, the manipulation, the lies that have come to light. But one thing I've learned is that trust is fragile, and it takes years to build, but only moments to destroy. If you've ever been betrayed by someone close to you, or if you've faced a situation where everything you thought you knew was shattered, I want to hear your story. Drop a comment below, share your experience, and let's talk about how we move forward after something like this. Don't forget to like this video if you found yourself in a similar situation, and subscribe for more real-life stories that dive into the complexities of relationships, trust, and betrayal. I'll see you in the next one.